Election polls, they're always wrong, aren't they? You might as well get monkeys to chuck darts at a board. Well, that's not quite fair. They're not completely useless, although you do have to be careful how you interpret them. So here are some things to bear in mind about how polls work. First, you can't ask everyone. More than 45 million people can vote at the next election. You really can't talk to them all. So, pollsters usually ask between 1,000 and 2,000 people a simple question. If there were a general election tomorrow, which party would you vote for? But if you only asked pensioners or people in Wales or the crowd at the Labour Party conference, this wouldn't be representative of the UK as a whole and you get a biased result. So, polling companies try to build a carefully balanced sample to get a snapshot of the national mood from just a couple of thousand people. But even with a representative sample, there are other factors to consider. For example, older people tend to be more likely to vote than younger people, and pollsters have to factor this into their calculations. And turnout among different groups of voters is one of the hardest things for pollsters to predict accurately. Second, polls aren't perfect. In the recent past, they've got it wrong because their samples weren't quite right. In 2015, pollsters counted too many Labour supporters and not enough of the people who voted to keep David Cameron in Downing Street. But 2 years later, the polls were wrong the other way and failed to pick up the scale of the Corbyn surge. There are often big differences between pollsters and they can't all be right. So, a bad sample can mean a poll misses the mark. But even with a good sample, polls cannot pinpoint a party's exact vote share. That's because of something called the margin of error. When pollsters say that a party is on 40%, what they really mean is they're confident the party is somewhere between 36% and 44%. So, if a party is up a bit in one poll, this may not be a genuine shift in the public mood. Third, despite all this, polls often are quite accurate. For example, they did a pretty good job in recent European Parliament elections in the UK. Where polls have got it wrong, they generally haven't been off by too much, but we've had lots of close elections recently, and when a race is tight, a small polling miss can mean getting the winner wrong. Fourth, vote share doesn't equal MPs. The constituency-based voting system in the UK makes it especially difficult to translate polls on national party support into parliamentary seats. The Conservatives gained votes in 2017 but lost seats. That's because it's not just about whether a party does well overall, but about whether they do better than their opponents in key constituencies. Ignore anyone who has a simple formula to predict who will win the most seats. So, how should you read the polls? Well, keep in mind, and this is really important, that polls tell you about people's views at a specific point in time. They're not a prediction of the final result. So if you see a poll a few weeks away from an election, the final result may end up very different. Not because the poll was wrong, but because people change their minds. Also, be very wary of any single poll. It's best to look at overall trends from several different polling companies. Our BBC poll tracker does this. Lastly, polls are interesting, but don't obsess over them too much. As politicians like to say, the only poll that matters is the one on election day.